Homeostasis. Homeostasis is keeping it at equilibrium, at a constant state. And the book goes over a number of these kind of basic homeostatic numbers. And I'm not going to ask you those numbers, at least right now. I'm not going to ask you those numbers. So there's going to be a slide here in a little bit, guys, that show, and gals, that show a bunch of different numbers and whatnot. And if I don't remember, here is your reminder here. I'm not going to ask those type of questions right now. When we get into the individual systems, there'll be some numbers that you'll have to know and remember. But right now, I think in a handful of slides, they go over some homeostatic numbers for certain biological functions. I'm not concerned with that right now. We're going to be going over a number of physiological processes, and you're going to have to know what is equilibrium, what is homeostasis, okay? What is that constant, stable internal environment going to be? Understanding that, then you can know how sodium and potassium, how they affect nerves, an axon of a nerve, and how that gets electricity to travel down a nerve from the brain, down a nerve track to a specific individual effector. Okay? Getting away from that equilibrium balance, a resting membrane potential, if you will. Okay? That's how nerves work, muscles work, pancreas with insulin and glucagon with sugar balance, okay? Blood pressure, number of different receptors that help to regulate and maintain homeostasis when it comes to blood pressure. Kidneys, lungs, the heart, the blood vessels, 4 major regions, all concerned with the same goal to help maintain equilibrium homeostasis. When it comes to these homeostatic kind of pathways, there are 2 major ways that we can do this. Primarily, the big one is negative feedback. There are a handful of positive feedback mechanisms. I mentioned that just a second ago when we talked about blood clotting. Blood clotting, birth, those are kind of your positive feedback loops that everybody thinks of. So if I was to ask for an example on an exam or a quiz question, those would be your examples, and I probably have it on a few slides from now. But when we think of feedback mechanisms, we think of negative feedback loops. Okay? No matter if it's a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop, you're really going to have 3 major things. Going to have sensors, and sensors are just nervous tissue. Okay? This is just nervous tissue. We have a number of neurons, specific neuroreceptors, that are detecting all sorts of stuff. Every ion that you can think of, we have a receptor for it pretty much. Okay? We have one for hydrogen ions to determine pH levels. We have oxygen, carbon dioxide, chloride ions, urea. We have water. We have receptors for everything under the sun. They detect these changes. They send that information to an integrating center. Okay, that's the third piece. Integrating centers are, the brain. Okay, respiratory centers within the pons, medulla oblongata. Okay, various different regions within the diencephalon, the hypothalamus and whatnot. Okay, specific regions that integrate that information and send out an impulse that changes something. And that impulse goes to an effector. Okay. And an effector makes the adjustment and gets a counter to what's been happening. Okay, so if temperature is going up, we have sensors that detect thermo changes, obviously thermoreceptors. We detect that, integrate it, send it to the different regions to cause an effect. And then we can start cooling down the temperature and it goes in the opposite direction. And that's what this slide says right there.
Effectors, would that be like sweat glands and
Booyah.
skin?
Yep, sweat glands. It could go to a muscle, cause vasodilation of blood vessels, and they get closer to the surface, and that would cool you off as well. So an effector is anything that does something. Gland, muscle. Okay. But good question. And they all have a normal range, and there's a sensor, and the sensor detects it when it starts to get above its normal homeostatic range. And then it senses it, sends it to the integrating center, and then we get an effect. Okay? And that's what they're just trying to show you here over and over and over again on these two little bitty pictures. Again, body temperature, like I say, is a really good example here of it. Okay. Once the body's cool, and then that obviously that sensor stops. And now there's nothing being sent to the integrating center. And there's nothing telling that muscle to vasodilate. So it doesn't vasodilate anymore. There's nothing telling the gland to produce a watery secretion anymore. So everything shuts off. Okay? Because it's not being told to do something. And we will see this ad nauseum throughout the entire semester. Yeah. The book talks about them being antagonistic. I mean, negative feedback is antagonistic, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. You're all smart people. When you're hot, the opposite is going to be cold. They're antagonistic. If blood sugar rises, it wants to get it back down between 70 and 100. So it's going to drop it. Once it drops below 70, it'll the opposite effect. It'll want to increase blood sugar. And so it'll go back up. Same thing with blood calcium levels. There's not enough calcium levels in the blood. Certain hormone, we have parathyroid, we have calcitonin. All of these guys are going to be involved in helping to regulate calcium levels by telling osteoclast activity to increase or stop. So all of these are also antagonistic events. I mean, then this is still negative feedback. Okay. This is where it says, there are specific values, and there are a number of them. I am not asking you to know these right now anyway. Okay. And these are pretty consistent. They may be slightly one way or another depending upon the book or the laboratory. But, for the most part, these are going to be some normal ranges of stuff that we try to keep things within. Okay. Again, if these things start to deviate, what does that indicate to you?
Something's wrong, or something can be wrong. I may not necessarily be wrong.
Yeah, something's wrong. Something can be wrong. Okay. The one thing to always remember with these things, guys, is that, like with some values within a lab, a normal range can be 0 to 100. So then, do you need to worry if you're at 100? Because on that little printout sheet, it's going to say right next to it, normal. If you
Not
have one,
necessarily.
are you a normal? Yeah, exactly. Not necessarily. Is it something to be cognizant of and pay attention to? Yes, it is. So when you're seeing these values and these numbers, I'm a values and numbers guy as much as the next person, but you have to take it with, you have to take these numbers and look at the totality of an individual. Okay? When it comes to health, it's not just, oh, you're missing avocados. And if you get avocados, it's not just one thing, one nutrient, not just one type of food. Okay. It's the totality of everything when it comes to health, your entire food profile, your diet, exercise, mental stuff. Okay. Are you happy? All those things go into being what's called healthy. I love it, because I teach nutrition class and I teach an on ground, I teach an online version. And in the online version, they ask, there's a blog that asks, who do you think's healthy and whatnot. And I love it because people say, oh, it's this person. They're so healthy. They do a really good job of taking all their medications to help prevent, their diabetes. That's not healthy. Okay. That's not healthy. At least my definition of healthy. Okay? And that goes to what sometimes these numbers are. Okay? Numbers can help you to figure out what's going on. They're not a gospel, though. Okay? And even though there's a number of numbers here and there's a number of numbers we're talking about, okay, when it comes to looking at numbers to figure out disease, dysfunction, they are just one part of it. You have to look at the totality of everything when it comes to, especially a person, a human, because you're a big Erlenmeyer flask that you're putting a bunch of things into, okay? And especially if you're an elderly person on the average 13 different medications, how in the hell do you know what all those medications do? There's not a study out there that looks at a number of individuals taking all those specific types of medications and what those actually do to all of these squirrely numbers. Okay. So even though it's going to be hammered into you, these are the numbers, from here on out, you got to take it with a grain of salt or an astute eye and look at everything. And that's all I'm trying to say. Positive feedback mechanisms, to get back on track, positive feedback mechanisms give you more of the effect. They amplify the process. All right. And again, blood clotting is the example. Okay. Blood clotting is a great example. It's an example that we will look at here in this class. All right. We'll look at the uterus and we'll look at what it is and what it does. But we're not going to get into the birthing process. Okay. But we'll get into the blood clotting process. Okay. There are a number of steps and a number of pathways associated with it. Some of those depend upon how you damage your blood vessel. Is it from the outside or is it damaged from within? Gives you a slightly different pathway. Either pathway, though, is a positive feedback mechanism where it exacerbates, it amplifies the effect over and over and over and over and over again. After we get through the first few chapters, which are like this one here, basic introduction stuff, this first couple, hell, even number 3, you guys have had anatomy. And if you've had certain individuals, I know you get a little bit more cell than others. So that one would probably be a review for some of you. But there are a number of ways these cells communicate with one another, which, again, by extension, allows these tissues to communicate with one another. And when it comes to various physiological processes, we'll talk about this. There are local mediators that help to regulate processes. And these are usually referred to as some kind of intrinsic regulation. Intrinsic means within. Okay. There are going to be feats that are going to be regulated by cells that monitor certain things and tell the other neighboring cells around it to react appropriately. We'll see this with the kidneys. We'll see this with the immune system. When a virus invades a cell, which this is fascinating. When a virus invades a cell, that cell's like, oh crap, I'm being invaded. So I'm going to secrete these secretions to tell my neighboring cells, hey, bolster up, suckers, because I'm getting invaded and I'm going to probably be dead. And if you don't bolster your defense, you're going to die too. So that's an intrinsic type of thing where it secretes some very localized paracrine-like secretions to tell the surrounding cells to be vigilant. I just like saying that word. Okay. There are other ways that we can regulate through receptors that have to go to the brain to be interpreted. Okay. The brain is not within your heart, right? It's not within your stomach, nervous or small intestine. Okay. So there are some instances where I have to send up information up to the brain to help regulate things, to send down a nervous command to tell the cells to do this. So we have the central nervous system. We also have hormones, okay? The endocrine system will get involved. We have a multitude of hormones that will tell other things in distant locations around the body, hey, you need to do this. Okay? We need to run from the bobcat in the parking lot, all right? So let's kickstart stuff. So we're going to secrete acetylcholine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, to help increase sympathetic response throughout the body so you can run away from the bobcat. Okay. Growing, thyroid hormone. Gets secreted and tells structures all over the dang body to start growing. Okay. So there are multiple ways that we're going to see this. And after the first few things here, the first chapter, the first unit, major unit that we look at is the nervous system. Okay. Because the nervous system is key to all of physiological mechanisms that we have. It's the neurons, it's the receptors, it's the glial cells. All of these things helping to get communication to happen, regulation to occur. Okay. So the very first system we jump out the gate with is going to be nervous system, which is a little bit different from anatomy and how they progress through their systems. And, I think I already said this. Innervates means send nervous input. You know it as an action potential. Hopefully. Action potential. All right. ACTIONPOTENTIAL. I'm not in mid-semester form yet with my writing. Okay. So we send an action potential to cause an effect, or we release hormones like the endocrine system does to have multiple effects throughout the entire system. So here they're looking at both neural and endocrine regulation. Okay. We have blood pressure. Homeboy is lying down. Homeboy gets up. If you've gotten up too fast, what have you experienced?
Like lightheaded.
Mm-hmm.
And you can sometimes pass out.
Yeah, lightheadedness, right? Feel like you're going to pass out. What is that, though? That's blood pressure falling pretty quickly. Right?
Like osteo something.
Orthostatic hypertension.
Yeah. Orthostatic hypertension. There are a number of different names that we're going to give this stuff. Okay. But the most basicness of it is basically that you are not getting enough blood flow to the brain. That's ultimately what it is. Okay. Because as soon as you start to move, we have receptors in a number of locations. Every single joint is going to have proprioceptive input, telling the body where it is in space. As soon as we go from the line here to a standing, that head's coming up. Gravity's pulling all that stuff down, right? So all that blood's getting pulled down. Not only do we have receptors for balance and equilibrium in the ears, proprioceptive input in all of my joints throughout the spine, but we have a number of receptors within the carotid bodies. We have a number of receptors in a couple other locations as well, aortic bodies. These are going to measure pressure changes within those blood vessels. They're going to sense that, and they're going to send that information up to the brain, the medulla oblongata. You can kind of see there. And then that's going to send out different nerve fibers to cause an effect. It's going to increase the heart rate. So it goes down and synapses on that sinoatrial node, that atrioventricular node, the myocardium, and gets it to increase the rate and force of contractions, help to raise the blood pressure. It goes to the blood vessels, causes vasoconstriction, to increase that blood going up to that brain. All of this, and you've all laid down and gotten up, right? You've all experienced that phenomena. This happens, and we're going to talk about it. And we're going to talk about it in all these tiny ass little steps. And it's going to be like, good God, this takes forever. No, it happens in a fraction of a second. Fraction of a second. And if for some reason you can't control that BP, well, then we'll get some hormones in. Okay. We'll get some hormones up in this thing. And those hormones are going to be coming from the kidneys for the most part. Liver maybe a little bit too, but for the kidneys. And it's going to help regulate blood pressure as well. So there are a number of these mechanisms, feedback mechanisms with a sensor, with a integrating center, and going out to some kind of effector. And sometimes it's A to B, and sometimes it's A to D through F. Yeah, 3 things, sure. Okay. Yeah, okay. Hormones, insulin, glucagon. Talk about that with sugars. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I apologize. I apologize. There's some repetition there. Feedback control mechanisms, negative feedback given. Okay. Yeah. I mean, just another example of showing you sensors, integrating centers, effector. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy.